David Curington, Encrusted Synths. The last three singles that I produced, entitled Anthesizer, Arabesque and Degradations, all have in common the idea of taking basically a fairly clean synth sound and putting it through lots of different filters, lots of different environments to really see what can be encrusted. I had the idea, I think, initially of this from a release I did called Neither the Time Nor the Place, which explores the idea of biophonic mastering. The idea in mastering, mastering is a very subtle process, obviously, it consists of quite a lot. But one of the things that a mastering engineer does is imparts a certain quality, a certain texture, a certain flavor to the whole sound of whatever it is they're dealing with. Some of the process, obviously, is quite subtle, quite clean, removing any errors, and can be quite technical, but it can also be quite creative as to what flavor you want to impart on the track. It really ends up saying something about what the overall aesthetic of the track is. This isn't something new, it's an approach that's really informed a lot of my ambient noise tracks that are to do with lots and lots of layers of sounds, lots of processing, all blended together into one great mass. But these three tracks have in common that they have a central focus, produced initially by quite clean synth sounds, which really allows the effect of what's been done to them to really come to the fore. And everything's very synchronous. All the layers are lined up so that you really hear the combined effect of them at once, as opposed to just an aggregate effect. My approach to creating music had really moved towards this approach through the releases Now and Remarketed. The starting point for Now was a little owl call that I have, and I ended up doing lots of different things to that, feeding it back through different environments, through bathrooms, exploring feedback through a reverb on my mobile phone. There's lots of things that went into it. But at the final stage in the mastering process, what I actually did was apply noise removal, fairly heavy noise removal to the entire mix, and a bit of a not very subtle plate reverb. And that was something new for me. I'd not really ever made the final process something so definite to the whole thing, and I think that's because I wanted something that was much clearer, something where the gestures really came through, as opposed to just having lots of different gestures with no particular focus. In Remarketed, the two tracks that are on that album start with the polished sounds of commercial royalty-free tracks. And these are, again, fed through different filters and through environments, but all in synchrony. So what you hear is almost as if 50 years later, this corporate royalty-free track is sort of sitting around on some server in the middle of some abandoned town in a desert. And what you hear is all the encrustation, all that's been done to it. First track of this group, Anthesizer, starts with some stock Logic synth sounds and also some live recorded improv with an amplified oboe reed, which just about pierces through actually in the mix despite all the encrustation, all that's been done to it. Whereas the stock Logic synth is very heavily distorted and you really just hear this kind of bubbly mass by the end of it all. The whole sound in the mix is passed through lots of digital filters, including one of my favourites, which is a Spectral Gate. It really has this wonderful bubbliness if you set it at a certain threshold. Maybe it's because much of my life is online through my day job as a maths tutor. I'm kind of used to the bubbly sort of Zoom audio filtered sound, and I don't know whether that's just sort of filtered into my artistic output. I quite like the sound of it. It really adds texture in an interesting way. There's other filters as well, such as a transient shaper, where if I feel like a sound's getting a bit too smooth, a bit too blended, that is actually always the danger, is if you do too much to a sound, it does just end up being very static. That was always the danger with previous releases that I've done, that if you do so much and you chop and layer and chop and layer and blend and process, you end up with something that is pretty close to just white or brown noise, and you really have to fight that and clarify certain elements and get it to this interesting tipping point where there is a certain consistency, but there's also a lot going on. The feel of the track is something quite... It's probably the closest that I'll ever come to some sort of banger, I suppose. It's got quite this sort of quite punchy bass sound, and even though the track's quite long and the structure of it's very loose, because obviously it's improvised, it's got this quite consistent heavy bass sound that somehow makes it a little bit more mainstream than anything I've done before. It just has this feel that it could well be some sort of club track or could be something more mainstream if it wanted to, even though it isn't at all. second track of the 3 is entitled Arabesque, which is the most classical name I've ever given anything I've ever done, really. And that's because it does have this very poised feel to it, and a treatment of gesture that's much more direct, but also sort of quite soft. The track was produced by cutting 9 phrases from a longer improvisation on 2 digital keyboard synths, and the harmony's largely pentatonic in it, which I suppose lent a high degree of self-similarity to the material, because if you start just, say, bashing around on black keys on a piano, pretty soon everything's going to sound kind of the same. And I used this to adopt an approach that wouldn't be too dissimilar to a lot of Feldman's works, for example, and explore the idea of disorientation of memory. So there's loops, there's near loops, there's sort of loops that come back but not quite, there's things that you think are going to be loops but then it moves on to something else. And it ended up being one of the longest of my tracks at sort of nearly 20 minutes. And it was very much composed, which was something that's unusual to me nowadays. So I very much thought and felt from moment to moment about how I was going to present these loops and what should come next, which is an idea that's quite alien to a lot of the ambient noise that I've produced. The last track of the 3 is called Degradations, and this was produced using a single synth. 4 very short phrases were recorded on it, but then these 4 different phrases were processed in lots of different ways, but this time, rather than having a treatment of the whole, the processing sort of branched out, really. I'd have these 4 phrases were then processed, then there were different processings of different versions of those, and so it was more like a kind of tree of lots of different synth samples. It's sort of there's 4 core starting points, but then processings of those, and then lower level different processings of those. So there's more a kind of tree structure to how the materials relate to each other. I then used these processings to generate 4 larger units, 4 bigger phrases. I suppose you could call them sentences if you want to apply classical terminology. And over time, these are looped. These 4, I suppose, sentences are looped over and over and over and over again. But over time, the sound blends into an iterative use of a de-hum filter, which is usually, I guess I am a big fan of using noise removal tools creatively. And interesting things happen if you take something that has a bit of harmony to it and apply an adaptive de-hum filter over and over and over and over and over again. What it does is it really strips away the harmony. You get this really quite ghostly sort of sound where all the core tones have been stripped. But it can also get quite glitchy as well, because if you change the tone of whatever you're applying a de-hum filter to, it will it'll quickly latch onto a different tone very suddenly. And so you kind of get this sort of quite hazy, noisy sound, but then it glitches quite a bit. And it really sounds quite disturbing. And I wanted to have this gradual blend into something which at the start, I don't know whether it's just the nature of the synth I used or the harmonic patterns. If I'm just improvising at a keyboard, my default is some sort of attempted Keith Jarrett impression. I think I had a go at doing some really awful Keith Jarrett impressions when I was much younger and I was playing piano more seriously. And that's kind of my default, I think. If I just go up to a keyboard and just play something, it comes out sort of kind of modal harmony, sort of with added seconds and sevenths and things, added fourths, that kind of thing. And I think it gives it this kind of nostalgic feel, but then that gradually morphs into something quite disturbing over the course of the track. It's really interesting that all the techniques that went into these three tracks, and also the kind of the layering and the blending and the sort of quite chaotic sound of the previous releases I've done, they've all gone, all these techniques that I've developed, so the noise removal, the encrustation, the chopping and layering, all of these things have really gone into the release that's going to come out, Mind Maps. But they're used in a very different way in Mind Maps. They're used with much more clarity, and there's much more of an appreciation for the topics that are associated with the material, the connotations, whereas everything in these three tracks and everything that I've done before is quite abstract. So that's really what the key difference is.